Should we sing happy birthday? All right. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Victoria. Happy birthday to you. It's a national holiday, too. It's like amazing. Okay, so we are going to be continuing our discussion of Solomon. Paul needs Solomon. Solomon took longer to build things than your complex, Paul. To build his compound, his palace took a lot of years. The temple was 7 years, and
we're not going for walls lined with gold and stuff like that.
Yeah. Anyway, so yes, Terry, we haven't even started, and you got a question.
Solomon didn't have to go through the city to get permits like you did.
That's right. He might have given his own permits.
Well, they had administration. David was pretty good about setting up administration, so they had all that stuff in place, I think, by the time Solomon took over. Okay, so we are going to be continuing our discussion of Solomon the second week. Going to be at least another week. I'm so nerdy. I'm sorry. I hope people don't get bored, because just a lot of stuff, and it's very interesting. So today we'll do a quick review. I'll try to be quick on it, but I always try in the review, try to add a little something that we didn't cover before. So I've got a couple of things to add. And we're going to talk primarily about the beginning, the first approximately 10 years of Solomon's reign. And then we'll get in later into next week, the grandeur and the demise. These three areas I've outlined, there's no crisp. I mean, we can, his kingship begins, that was pretty crisp. We know when that happened in 970 BC. But the others are they all kind of just overlap, meld together. So we'll try to sort some of that out as we go along. So that is what we're going to do today. So let's just start out with the little review. I always have this chart, so you know where we are. We're right here in the United Kingdom, always in the United Kingdom for a while. And we're really talking about Solomon, who was the heir to the throne. He overlapped, of course, with David. We talked about the harmony of the books, Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, that you've got to look at all those. When it comes to Solomon, he at least wrote 2 Psalms. Pretty sure most, if not all, of the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. So when you're really looking at Samuel, there's a lot of material. Okay, even though most of Samuel, as far as these books are concerned, are covered in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, a little in the others, but primarily there. We talked about this whole period. Kind of started, we talked about, the prophet Samuel that led to the kingship of Saul and the problems there. Then the early life of David and his running from Saul. And last week we went into quite a bit of detail about King David, his 7.5 years in Hebron, and then his 33 years in Jerusalem. So that's the stuff we covered last week. I'm throwing in a little extra here because I didn't get to talk about archaeology last time. I always like to throw in a little archaeology. I'm not going to go into all this, but there's a lot of archaeology in this era, a lot of archaeology. So certainly we got the city of Jerusalem and the city of David, that area of Jerusalem and the city of David. There's been a lot of excavation, a lot of stuff unturned. There's just tons of stuff that's been done. And it still goes on today. It's an area where, of course, there's a lot of conflict with various factions there. So, and the city's grown, and there's so a lot of the archaeology. There's a lot of issues trying to do more archaeology in that area. Along the Mediterranean coast, we had Megiddo, which is one of Solomon's chariot cities he set up. There's been a lot of archaeology done there. In Gedi, if you remember, this is where David hid from Saul. It's not really an archaeological site as much as today it's a massive nature preserve area. It's a very beautiful area, I'm told. Who's been to? See, Joya, always facts checking me. Yes. So it's not an archaeology site, especially, but it's just it's a national park there, right? Yeah. Okay. And then, of course, we have several major cities: Dan to the north, Shechem, and Shiloh. And today we'll be talking about a couple others. So there's just a lot of archaeology to back up this period of history. Okay, so let's talk here about the beginning of his reign as king. And I wanted to kind of throw this out because I usually try to talk about what's going on in the world at this time. So I threw up a whole bunch of approximate dates. Remember, dates are not, they're not too. So the Iron Age, this is about 1200 to 600 BC. Depending on what region of the world you're in, that date moves a little. But basically, that's what we call, when you hear archaeologists and historians talk about the Iron Age versus the Bronze Age, this is the period we're talking about, which is where we are. Things were going on in the country at that time. I mean, in the world. The Shang dynasty in China, which had been the major dynasty, was ending about this period. And the Zhao, is that how you say it? Zhao? Zhao? Zhou? Okay, dynasty started in that period, okay? Hiram, which we've talked about and we'll talk about more, became king of the Phoenician city-state of Tyre in just about this time. The Phoenician is one of the few other nations that were not in conflict with the Israelites. David became friends with Hiram. They did a lot of commerce together. David got most of his materials and stuff with the help of Hiram that were used to build the temple. This Pharaoh was the Pharaoh of Egypt about that time. It's the end of the, I should ask Joy this. I think he's the last Pharaoh in the 21st dynasty. And the 22nd dynasty, Shishak, was the Pharaoh, and he gets involved shortly after here with Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And so, but this is the Pharaoh we believe, whose daughter becomes Solomon's wife. Okay, the temple of Hera was constructed in Olympia. Say, well, what is that? Well, we know about when this happened in 975, and that was a temple. She was the queen goddess of the Greek gods. I think it was a period of time where it was, and Zeus was involved, but that's just kind of that was happening at the time. Of course, we know that Solomon was co-regent with David for about a year. And of course, we're going to talk about this period of time, starting today, about 970, when he becomes king. But to put this in perspective, Homer in Greece, which we all hear about Homer, he's 100 years later, okay? Not, Rome isn't founded for 200 years before Rome is founded. Okay, so kind of put some of these things in perspective. The first Olympics happened about 750. Nothing of any significance is going on in North America. And the major empires of Central and South America don't really even happen until about after the death of Christ. So, okay. Anybody have any questions about that? This is just kind of leveling.
I noticed in your dates that the going to Jerusalem was 1,000 years before Christ was born, almost exactly.
Yeah.
I never heard that.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of. There's a lot of time that goes on, between, the conquest, Judges, then we get to the United Kingdom, before we get to the silent period and so forth. Okay, so now let's talk about Solomon and much of my time. Okay, so he's gonna take the throne. Okay, so we talked about this a bit last week. We'll just kind of go over and add to it. So some things were going on. David is very sick. He's dying. At that time, his oldest surviving son, Adonijah, he's the oldest surviving son, and he kind of takes it on himself that he is going to be the king. The story really talks about it, kind of says it's a conspiracy to take the throne. It may be, but he was the heir apparent, and so he starts doing things to set himself up to be king, and he is aligned with Joab, who was David's main general we talked about, okay? So Joab kind of sides with him and is doing things to put him into power. About that time, Nathan the prophet, and Nathan is the main prophet in the story of Solomon, and he appears to be, if you will, the tutor, the trainer of Solomon. So Solomon grew up under Nathan as a mentor, if you will. And by the way, Solomon is born way back. These guys are adults when he's born, so there's maybe a 20 years difference. Not sure exactly, but anyway, so Nathan and Bathsheba, who is David's last wife, we all know that story, but they get, what's that?
You're going to hear that story in church today.
Well, I don't want to steal your thunder. Okay, so they get wind of the fact that Adonijah is doing this, is trying to take over, and so they go, Nathan tells Bathsheba to go to David and tell him, we got to do something about this, so she does, and reminds David that he had said that Solomon would be the king. And so she goes to him and he intervenes. They quickly anoint or appoint Solomon as king, kind of a quickie ceremony, then later they do a little more formal. So he becomes the king. So he's proclaimed king, and that's when his kingship starts. Now, David is still alive, and probably is alive for about a year or so. So during that time, David is going to impart a lot of his knowledge, wisdom, thoughts to Solomon. Okay. Any questions about this period? We kind of talked about some of that already. Okay, so the first thing Solomon does is he kind of cleans house. So if you remember, David left Solomon with a peaceful nation, basically. David had taken care of their enemies. He either had destroyed their enemies, put them into servitude, or in the case of the Phoenicians, the Philistines, excuse me, had driven them back into their own little area and kind of restricted them there. So that all is going on, had gone on. So it's kind of a peaceful, but he's still got some internal issues. David in talking to Solomon said, there's a couple of my guys that need to get taken care of. So, and plus, his brother was on his list of people to take care of, Solomon's list. At this time, remember the young, beautiful virgin that was the caretaker of David in the last time. She was his caregiver and bed warmer. He goes to Bathsheba, and the brother, goes to Bathsheba and says he wants to marry her. And so Bathsheba said, "What, doesn't sound bad to me." So she goes to Solomon. Well, Solomon is livid, because that is, even though she wasn't a wife, she wasn't really a concubine. Indication, Scripture said there was no sexual relationship there, but she was still part of his harem, and that was a power thing. If you take on one of the prior king's harem, that was a power thing, and Solomon is livid. All three of these gentlemen, Joab, who had done a lot of things to offend him, had killed Abner, if you'll remember, who was the general under Saul, but also Saul's son. And there was just a lot of things that David wanted him taken care of. And then there was the guy that when David was fleeing from Adonijah, when he was during this conspiracy, he had fled this one guy who was a member of the house of Saul, cursed him and tried to, threw stones at him, whatever. David kept his cool, but told his son, take care of him too. So Solomon takes care of these people. They're all dead. So we have very peaceful time at hand. Okay, early on in Solomon's kingship, and before he was king, he was very spiritual. Like I said, he was taught by Nathan, and he was very close to God. So he starts out, we'll say, in a good place as far as his spiritual relationship was concerned. But about this time now, so early on, we're in the first few years of Solomon's reign. So he decides he's going to have a festival, celebration. He's going to go to Gibeon, and they're going to have a feast. And he's going to do sacrifice. It's going to be a big party celebrating, if you will, his ascension to the throne. Why did he go here? Because this Gibeon is still where the tabernacle is. If you remember, when the Philistines invaded, they took the ark, they moved the tabernacle to Gibeon. The ark is not there. The ark is back, but David at this time has already moved the ark to Jerusalem and puts it in a tent. But it was never called the tabernacle, but it indicates that they were still doing sacrifices here, and they probably were doing sacrifices in Jerusalem during this period. So there's a reason why, it's a spiritual reason why they would be going to the city, which is very close to Jerusalem. At that time, in a dream, while he's there, in a dream, in that dream, Solomon has a conversation with God. And God basically asks him, what does he want? What would he like? Your heart's desire, if you will. And Solomon says he wants wisdom and discernment. God's very pleased, says you're going to get that, and you're going to get a lot more, as long as you're obedient to me. So there's a little caveat there. This obedience seems to always get in the way. So he has this dream, and basically he starts doing it. So an example of his wisdom is the story of the harlots who both had infants same time. One dies during the night. They both claim the remaining infant is theirs. They go to Solomon to solve the problem. He's the wisest man in the world. They go to him to solve the problem, and Solomon thinks about this and decides, okay, I got the solution. I'm going to take my sword, I'm going to cut that baby in two, and you can each have a half. Solve the problem. At that time, the one of the women is all for it. The other woman says, no, let her have the baby. Okay, Solomon says she's the mother and gives the infant to her. So just an example of this wisdom. Sometime during these early years, Solomon, makes a treaty with Pharaoh Egypt, and as part of that treaty, he marries the Pharaoh's daughter. When I read a lot of the history, there's a question: was it the Pharaoh's daughter? Was it family? Pharaoh's daughter. There's questions there, but and this apparently is pretty common. We always have this question, why do all these people have multiple wives? Well, it's pretty common as far as treaties were concerned for political or economic reasons to seal them with a marriage. So it's not unusual. By the way, Solomon, pretty sure Solomon was married and had a child before he became king. We know that when he dies, he has a 41-year-old son. So probably he was married before. We don't know how many wives he had. Of the 700, we don't know when they came about. But so he had one at least before he became king, and we know he has this one. Like I said earlier, we believe this Pharaoh is the last Pharaoh, the sixth and last Pharaoh of the 21st Egyptian dynasty. And if we remember, we talked about dynasties a long time ago. And dynasties were kind of, if you will, kind of a family lineage. When that changed, they would have a different dynasty. Okay, so that's kind of, something changed. You have one dynasty and another. It wasn't just they said, oh, let's make this in 21, this one 22. It wasn't like that. There's a reason why we changed dynasties. We'll talk about this a little bit later. I'm going to talk about Gezer, but after the marriage, the Pharaoh goes and captures and destroys Gezer, which was still part of the Philistines' territory. Gone on the edge, but it was still part of the Philistine Empire at that time. So it's not a part that David had ever conquered. So the Pharaoh captures. Now, this is in southern Israel, what is now in the area what we now call the Gaza Strip. So the southern, western side of Israel. So he does this, and he gives the city to his daughter as a dowry. Gave my daughter a burnt up city. I thought, but he gave her the territory anyway. we'll leave that story for a minute, for now. And he also at this time starts the building of the temple, his first major building project. And we talked when we talked about the resurrection, we talked about Herod the Great. He was such a builder. I think he learned from reading about Solomon's, because Solomon did a lot of building projects. But the temple is the first one. It was the project that his dad had started and wanted to build the temple. God told him, no, you can't do it because you've been a bloody man and sinful man, and your son will be the one who will build the temple. But he has already have a relationship with the king of Tyre and starts acquiring all the materials to start building the temple. So David put a lot of this stuff in motion and had imparted all this information on his son, the plan and what needed to do and what was done. And so a massive amount of the wealth that Israel had and was acquiring was put to this project. You got to start thinking about the people of Israel, the Israelites. They are being burdened tax-wise, starting early on in his kingship. He's got to fund all this stuff. So it's not, Hiram wasn't just giving him the lumber. He wasn't just, mining the gold. Well, he was doing some of that too. But anyway, it was being paid for by to your tax money at work. So the work began in the 4th year of his reign. So, doing the math, about 966 BC, he starts building. The building is built of stone. I think most of the materials were not. I've read stuff that said they weren't doing this heavy preparing these things right there because weren't supposed to use implements of war to help build the materials, so iron things. So stuff was built and brought to the site. So it was built of stone. The interior was paneled with cedar from Lebanon, and that cedar was overlaid with gold. Very, very, very magnificent structure, and it took 7 years to build. So have heart, Paul. You're way faster than Solomon. Okay, it then sets about furnishing the tabernacle or the temple, and these things are all described in a lot of detail in Kings and Chronicles, First Kings and First Chronicles. So he finishes all the interior. During this time, he is preparing for the dedication of the temple. It takes about a year, almost a year, preparing for the dedication. They eventually move the ark, which is already in Jerusalem, but they move it into the temple. Okay? So that all takes place. So the dedication of the temple was a big, big deal. I mean, this is bigger than the Super Bowl. I mean, it lasted for 14 days, the celebration. So Solomon prepared for it, like I said, for about 11 months preparing. The entirety of the Jewish people came to Jerusalem. We used to talk about the number of people coming at Passover. Well, there were a lot fewer, at this time than 1,000 years later, but a lot of people converge on Jerusalem for this celebration. Like I said, the ark was put into the Holy of Holies. He does prayer of dedication and blessing of the people, and then he slaughters a lot of sheep and oxen. Like They say 120,000 sheep and 21,000 oxen. That's a lot of barbecue. And they feasted, and the celebration lasted for 14 days. And then he's told everybody to go home. Okay? So, I'm slightly ahead of schedule. It's okay. Anyway, so I kind of want to end this part of the story right here. Yes?
Did he stop taxing the people after the temple, or did he continue to use taxing for his own personal gain?
Did he continue taxing?
The people after he finished the temple?
Oh, heavens, yes. We'll talk next week about his other projects, which kind of dwarf the temple, some of his other things. So, oh no. As we see over the life of Solomon, actually the burden on the people gets worse and worse and worse. Those are some of the things that lead to his demise. Okay? Okay. Yeah?
A couple things I thought of as well. First of all, in that prayer of dedication, God doesn't have to agree. That's part of his prayer, and then the Holy Spirit, God descends. That's God's endorsement. Another thing is that one of the most famous verses in all of 2 Chronicles is 7:14, which is, and we quote it oft here in our society, if my people which are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways. That was actually given at that same exact time. People think that that was given at a time of spiritual decline, but it's actually at a spiritual high.
Yeah, a spiritual high.
Now, because we're in a spiritual decline, but that promise was given as a part.
And remember, God told him, you're going to have all this as long as you're obedient. So he becomes less and less obedient. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit just about the two cities that we've mentioned here. Just because the history and the archaeology is kind of interesting. So the city of Gibon, which has a long history as a city in that part of the world. It existed for a long time. It was a Canaanite city, and the Hivites were the people that occupied that. And it was probably a greater city than Ai and Jericho that Joshua had captured. Okay, so it was kind of a city-state because there's a number of other towns around Gibon that were part of the same area. It's first mentioned as it relates to the Israelites when Joshua was assaulting that whole area. So picture this. The conquest has started. We've taken Jericho. We go up and take Ai. They're going to be moving north. Along come these people. This delegation, all tattered from such a long journey. And they go to, first of all, these people were afraid that what happened to these other communities is going to happen to them. So they concocted this idea to try and get a treaty with Joshua. So they deceive him, lead him to believe that they've come from a long way and that they want to be his ally. He agrees to this. Okay, so they have a treaty. Lo and behold, they find out, it's just over the hill, this area. It's not very far. And Joshua is pretty upset about that, but he had a treaty. So he basically put him in servitude. But they were allies, if you will. But he was not very happy with how they did it. And so they became the servants of the Israelites. Yeah. Let's see. This action, what happened there, kind of gets leads to other troubles later. So Saul hated the Gibeonites. And, well, he didn't like anybody that wasn't an Israelite. And so, because of this, I mean, there was a battle, and Saul destroys a lot of the Gibeonites. So that's going to play in a little bit later in the story. But just to know, so this area was part of the area given to the Benjamites. That was part of their territory, and it was a city was given to the Levites. So, like I said, the intolerance of Saul led to this destroying, which then David came to the rescue of these people, and that all kind of plays into the picture later on when the Philistines, we said this earlier, when the Philistines captured the ark and the Israelites moved the tabernacle before it could, and they moved it to Gibeon. It became the center for sacrifice and other things for several years. Okay, later, moving along in time, just things that happened. This area is just intertwined throughout the whole these books. So the Abner and Joab, remember there was a civil war right at the beginning of David's reign with Saul's son, and Abner is the general for Saul's son, Joab for David. They're warring with each other. They had a period of time where they meet at the pool of Gibeon, and they try to settle their issues by 12 of your best men against 12 of my best men, and we'll settle this. It's kind of like Goliath, Come on, one of your guys against me, whoever wins, wins. So they tried to, it didn't work, but they did that. Abner kind of runs, and Joab goes after him. Okay, we just talked about that's where Solomon went to celebrate his becoming king. And just for your information, it still plays a picture throughout this history. So 500 years later, Nehemiah's these people are helping Nehemiah build the walls, and that false prophet was from there. So this city is just throughout and covers a whole huge period of time. So I didn't talk about but there has been a lot of excavation, archaeological work done in that city. So way back, I mean, they've had excavations going on, and probably the most spectacular part of the stuff that they've discovered is that pool, which was a water storage area. That's one of the most significant things that was been uncovered. So a lot of good archaeology there. So the other city, Gezer, so it's located on the border, like we said. It was that whole area, southern Israel, I mean, over the millennia, Egypt, and now the Hittites, right? It's just a very volatile area. The Egyptians are up in that area all the time. At different times, they're in control of the area. So it goes way back to prior to the Iron Age, and there's just a lot of history there. Like I said, the Egyptians dominated that whole area early, but by the 13th century, which is a couple hundred years before, their power's kind of starting to wane, but they still do incursions up in that area, but not like it used to be. During the conquest, like we said, this is an area, remember, we didn't take all the territory God told them to take during the conquest. The Philistine area and this area was an area that was not taken. So it isn't until David when they're kind of, the Philistines put under control, if you will, within their little boundary. And then, of course, Pharaoh comes along and takes care of the city and gives it to his daughter, and to Solomon. And then Solomon later rebuilds this as a very important strategic city. Gezer was a very strategic location on the intercoastal commerce route and the road to Jerusalem. So it was a very strategic place. So it was very desirable. So so there's been a lot of archaeological work done in the early 1900s, again in 1923. More recently, a lot of they've unearthed a lot of the stuff that was the rebuilding that Solomon rebuilt. They've unearthed a lot of that stuff. So there's a lot of stories coming out and documentation coming out of that particular period. So, does anyone have any questions? Because I'm going to quit here.
Is Gezer like a 55 plus community?
What's that?
I said, is Gezer a 55?
Before or after it was destroyed? I don't know. I don't really know. But when you're studying the Old Testament, there's so much interesting stuff here, and you kind of tie all these things together. It's like, stuff makes sense. That's why I love it, because there's just so much stuff. And we'll come back to some of these things as we proceed through the discussion. So nothing else. So next week we'll see how far we get next week. But we're going to start talking about the grand Solomon and all his stuff. I mean, he was a builder par excellence. Yes?
Did we get to talk about his wives?
Yes, we will, George, except there's so little detail. In my head, I try to wrap my head around 700 wives. I have a hard time figuring out 700 wives in 40 years, let alone if it was in the first 20 years. But, I can imagine he had this room full of women and had mass marriage and, joined the harem. Yes?
From my research yesterday after we talked, most of the women in the 700 were political alliances.
Yeah, I can't imagine how many political alliances, Do I have access to the 7-Eleven? Oh, I'll marry a woman. So we'll have a treaty there. I don't know. Yeah, we'll talk about it, George, but there's not a lot of data, but I'm open for data if you have it. Could be. Died of natural causes. Oh, never mind. This is getting R-rated. We gotta stop this. Let's end with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this time together. Bless our service about to begin, and just look forward to a great day, and hopefully see all of you tonight at the pastor's house. We just ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.